Okay, sorry about that. Ran into some technical difficulties, but yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today we'll be diving into leveraging PyTorch for bias reduction in AI. So we'll explore how, as developers, we can use PyTorch to ensure that our AI models provide fair and accurate results. So this is like a beginner level talk for those who are kind of just starting out with PyTorch. But if you are familiar with PyTorch and are like a AI genius, well, I still hope you walk away learning something. So let's get started. So first off, let's try and understand what exactly AI bias is. So this occurs when a model makes an unintentional error due to inherent issues in the input data. So there are three main types of bias, which include interaction, latent, and selection bias. So I'll go over each one and explain how each one happens. So interaction bias occurs when the impact of one variable depends on the presence of another variable. So essentially, it arises due to the interaction between your variables. And failing to account for this in statistical analysis can lead to biased or inaccurate conclusions. Next, we have latent bias. So this refers to bias that isn't immediately apparent. So it's more of a subtle form of bias that can be embedded in the data or your analysis, which can make it pretty challenging to detect. So this can arise from uncontrolled variables that influences the outcomes of your study. So even the researchers might not be aware of its existence. So just to give an example, if participants in a study on drug use, if you ask them like, oh, how many drugs do you take? They might not, be entirely truthful or underreport because they're afraid of legal repercussions. So that study may have some latent bias in it. Selection bias occurs when the sample or data used in the study is not representative of the population from which it was drawn. So it happens when you kind of, certain groups of individuals are more likely to be included or excluded. So if you survey a bunch of young kids about their internet usage, it may not, accurately represent the internet usage of the whole population. And another real world example of this is the gender bias in AI-based recruitment. So for example, recruitment systems would rate male applicants higher than female applicants, even with similar qualifications, just because the underlying data used for training the model exhibited these same biases, which can originate from the historical data from which it was trained on. So I just wanted to talk about this case study that I found about the bias in facial recognition systems. So usually facial recognition algorithms boast a pretty high classification accuracy of over 90%, but these outcomes are not essentially universal. So there was a growing body of research which exposed the divergent error rates across several demographic groups, with the poorest accuracy consistently found in female subjects who were Black and 18 to 30 years old. So in a 2018 study called Gender Shades, there was an intersectional approach to appraise 3 different gender classification algorithms, including those developed by IBM and Microsoft. So subjects were grouped into 4 categories: darker skinned females, darker skinned males, lighter skinned females, and lighter skinned males. So all 3 algorithms performed the worst on darker skinned females, with error rates up to 34% higher than for light skinned males, which is in figure 1. So there are several steps being taken to address this kind of bias. So these approaches focus on improving the technical algorithmic performance. They're also including more tests, which should be carried out using a more diverse set of faces, which are varying in age, ethnicity, gender, and other variables. So this could involve using standardized benchmarks, as well as finding data sets that are, more diverse, essentially. And then once you identify this bias, you just need to adjust your model in response to that. So the cornerstone of PyTorch's approach to AI bias, they give you a lot of powerful tools that allow you as developers to really identify, manage, and reduce this bias, such as handling misrepresentations and tweaking how your model learns. PyTorch allows us to dig deep into our network and examine individual layers, monitor performance, and adjust the learning sequences, which gives us a lot of control over the learning process of our models. So let's take a more detailed look on how PyTorch's capabilities allow us to address AI bias and promote transparency and fairness in our models. So as developers creating models that are capable of driving decisions in lots of different domains and fields, there lies a pretty significant burden. on our shoulders. So we have to make sure that our models are ethical, transparent, and make unbiased judgments. So this entails understanding the source of biases, the impact of our bias propagation, and making sure that we continuously test our models for fairness. So the goal of unbiased output is to ensure that all demographic groups are treated fairly. So this involves careful consideration, starting from the initial data collection stage to choosing balanced and representative data sets for training the AI. PyTorch gives you the tools you need to really understand your data, and with lots of features that mitigate this bias, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So for example, PyTorch's automatic differentiation mechanisms, along with its support for various neural network architectures, allows for pretty different regularization techniques. And using these things, you can really manage how your model learns and mitigate these biases. PyTorch equips us with several different things that allows us to mitigate these biases. So first, I'd like to talk about the data loader class, which randomizes your input data. You can shuffle it and eliminate order-based bias, which happens a lot in some models and is often overlooked. Next, I'd like to talk about torchvision.transform, which offers a suite of tools for data augmentation, which makes it possible to increase diversity in your data samples. So essentially, it can be used to apply data augmentation techniques, such as random cropping, flipping, and rotation on your input data. So essentially, it can help reduce bias by increasing the diversity of your training data. And last but not least, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard from a lot of genius folks today from PyTorch Lightning, it is a wrapper around PyTorch, which simplifies your model training. And it has a lot of different features, such as training loops and model checkpointing, which leaves you a lot of more time to focus on the experiment design and achieving the right results. Just a couple more things I wanted to talk about. So these are a couple more tips that I learned while I was playing with PyTorch. So the dog is unrelated. I just thought it was cute. So overfitting is one of the primary sources of bias. This happens when the model becomes highly specialized on your training data and fails to generalize to new data. The dropout technique drops neurons randomly during your training, which allows your model to become more robust and prevents overfitting. And next, we have batch normalization, which standardizes the inputs to a layer for each mini batch, which maintains a lot more stability in your learning process and reduces overfitting too. I wanted to highlight some really cool third-party libraries for bias detection that might be helpful in reducing your bias in your model. So yeah, PyTorch has a lot of robust functionalities, but these third-party libraries I feel like can help a lot more as well. So the first one I'd like to mention is AI Fairness 360, which is a toolkit that helps teams detect and mitigate discrimination and bias in machine learning models. Next is Interpret ML, which is an open source Python library that provides tools for training interpretable models, and it also explains black box models. So this can be used to identify sources of bias in machine learning, as well as explain model predictions. FairLearn is a Python package developed by Microsoft. It provides algorithms for mitigating unfairness. It also provides a really cool interactive dashboard that allows you to explore the trade-offs between different fairness metrics. And last but not least, I'd like to mention Captum, which is a PyTorch model that helps with interpretability. So this allows you to understand how models work and make decisions. So while it doesn't eliminate bias directly by itself, it helps a lot in mitigating bias by providing transparency and interpretability of the model's decision-making process. So this transparency helps a lot in identifying potential sources of bias in data or the model's behavior. And yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have the balanced data sets, but also to, apply a lot of cross-validation in these data and in your models just to make sure that, your outputs reflected this. Yeah, so that was about 10 minutes. And yeah, I added a QR code, but it just leads to a website, which leads to my Twitter. So you can just go to my Twitter directly. Yeah, so any questions? So when you load your data in like a specific order, sometimes this can affect how your data is managed by the model. So if you shuffle it beforehand, this helps increase the randomness and provides like more even results, if that kind of makes sense. Because sometimes if you have it in a very specific order, the model takes that into account. So the question is, do you think accounting for these variables would sacrifice some accuracy in the model? Is that the question? Okay, okay. I won't say that I am like an ML expert by any means, but I'm sure that a lot of you folks are a lot smarter than me and can handle that issue a lot in your ML models. I do think that is like an important consideration, and obviously you would need to like make sure that your models can account for a lot of these biases. It doesn't really mean to like make your data set more homogeneous or ignore some data in favor of, you know, eliminating bias, but just making sure that I think you have more data than less data would help a lot in that. Yeah. Yes. So the question is, if I know there's some sort of bias in my content, what would I do to address that? So there are basically two main ways that people handle these kinds of things. They're either, if you know what the bias is, then you can oversample your underrepresented groups. And the other direction that I see people use is undersampling your overrepresented groups. So just kind of ensuring that if you already know what groups are underrepresented and what data you need, just making sure you get more data from that specific group or less data from your, you know, overtuned groups usually helps. Okay, thank you.